So that means I gotta start over again. Forget it. So first, I'm John Morgan. My family came on the wagon trains in the 1850s, settled and homesteaded in Lynn County. My hometown is Lebanon. Born and raised there. Went to Oregon State for a couple years. Decided to get a real education. Transferred to Willamette. I have a degree in urban and regional government and in political science. And my career has been focused totally on Oregon's communities, both as a planner and as a city manager. The last 20 years, been in a consulting role, working with local governments all over the state, as well as county governments and state agencies on planning issues, also on city management. I've been a city manager, and I get to do a lot of organizational assessment work, helping city halls do better at what they do. Big joy of my life is teaching this type of class, because I know there's a lot of people out there in Oregon that don't understand the fundamentals of the state planning system and how it works. And yet they are members of planning commissions or city councils and responsible for that. And I think in teaching this, the core of this class over the last 15 years, I've been able to help hundreds and hundreds of people just be more effective in doing the work they do. And hopefully that'll be the same for you. In this Zoom environment, we can't go around and do a whole lot of introductions. So let's just let that go. You all know each other, I think. Unless anyone wants to jump in and introduce themselves. Anyone have anything to say? Okay. I am going to use a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to share my screen right now. And then I'm going to jump back and forth as we go through things. But please, any questions at any time, any comments, throw them in the chat, raise your hand. Taylor's helping me by keeping an eye on the chat, and I will stop and respond to those at any time. We've got our time frames and a lot to cover, but still, this is for you. I'll do all I can to help you have a successful time together. I asked staff why this workshop was requested, and it just came out of a lot of the leadership structure of City Hall that was anxious to, I think I could say, just be better in terms of understanding with all the issues at play in the community and all the things that can happen. Just one place where you can have a conversation with each other. I'm here to facilitate that, as well as provide some key information, and hopefully we'll get some really positive outcomes out of this. The name of this core class that I teach, even though we're going to focus a lot on urban growth management, is Planning in Oregon, Building Successful Communities. I've been teaching this basic class, like I say, for over 15 years. I was asked to do it by the League of Oregon Cities originally, and have taught the basic class probably 250 times in the interim, all over the state, all kinds of communities. But one of the things that the league wanted was for me to incorporate in the title of it this phrase, building successful communities. That happens to be the mission statement of my consulting firm, and they really liked that. The staff there wanted me to put that in. And let me explain just a little bit what that means, just those three words. Building's pretty obvious. We are all about creating the future. You in your volunteer roles, your staff and their professional roles, me and my role that I could get to share around the state. It's all about building the future. So building's pretty obvious. So jump to communities. Primarily, of course, we're talking about Oregon's communities of place, its incorporated cities, and but also this can really be reflected a lot of ways in other kinds of communities. Communities of common interest and that kind of thing. I've done this class on a regional basis a number of times, where the community really is a group of cities that are bound together economically or housing market, and they want to take a broad regional look. So communities is a pretty broad term. But the important term to think about is successful. And that means successful as defined by you. Now, we're going to talk about some of the parameters the state puts on the work that you do, but those things should not be limiting factors to your achievement of success as you define it. And in no way am I here representing the Department of Land Conservation and Development or DEQ or ODOT, and I certainly am not here representing Thousand Friends of Oregon or Oregonians in Action or the Home Builders Association at all. In fact, I steer away from memberships or participation in any kind of group like that so that I can be very neutral in presenting this class. But every one of them has a definition of success they'd love to impose on you. And you need to ignore that as best you can and really, really work hard to create your own definition of success and then the strategies to get there. Hopefully what I can offer you this evening will help you do that. Here, Mr. Osborne may be excused. My brain is full. So just a little bit of logistics. If your brain gets full, great, go out, whatever you need to do. Bathroom breaks, coffee breaks, dinner breaks, whatever, anytime. We're highly informal, and all I ask is that you just jump in when you have to ask a question, like I've said before. We will take at least one break halfway through the evening and then hopefully get done by about 9 o'clock tonight. Here is what it's all about. I'm thinking of pursuing a career in city planning. What fun. And Page's house over on the left, if you follow the maze to try to go to the places you might be interested, ice cream parlor, movie theater, etc. You can't get there from here, and everything pretty much ends up in the alligator pit. This defines really what this urban planning thing is all about. And a lot of people will look at this and say, yep, that about explains it. Our role tonight, or hopefully we all can do together, is find ways to not really work through the maze, because you just can't, but to jump over the walls, break the maze down, redesign it, whatever it is. Let's not take anything as being in concrete when we approach this planning work. Basic agenda, we're talking about history, context, and these things. The blue line basically represents the break that we're going to take, but I'm going to modify a little bit based on conversations and input from you, and especially the mayor and Denise and Taylor, when we're going to, after tonight, focus a little bit more on how we best approach what you want in our second evening together. So we may or may not cover all these things. We may actually modify them somewhat as we go. I have a question for you, and this is your first participation piece. The question is simple. This is only for the planning commissioners and council. What is your job? So let you unmute yourself and answer that question. What is your job?
Represent the people's will.
That's a great answer, but I'm going to say that is a characteristic of how you do your job. That's not your job. What is your job? Anybody? What is your job?
To make decisions.
Bingo. Well done. Well done. That's great. That was Paul, right?
Yeah, I sat in, I caught a little bit of one of your other ones. So this will fill in the gaps here.
You got it. He cheated. Yeah, usually it takes it can go 10 minutes sometimes. And people say things like, to protect the community, protect our economic development, listen to all the people, synthesize and come out with answers and all kinds of stuff. No, your job is to make decisions. I mean, that's the fundamental bottom line of what the citizens of the community of Damascus want you to do. All those other things are characteristics or their outcomes or their frameworks for how you do your job. But your job is to make decisions. We're in a representative democracy, even at the local government level. You are there elected by the voters or as an extension of the city council, appointed by the council to make decisions so that the rest of the city doesn't have to. That's bottom line. The whole town doesn't come together, and the to vote or the kind of things, the town halls we hear about sometimes in New England, We don't do that. What we do is create these official bodies that the voters trust, that they elect, they expect that they will make decisions and do the best they can on their behalf. Now, I'm going to switch back again to the slides because I think that an important thing to take into account are, just really kind of three characteristics. If your goal is to make decisions, that's what your job is, I'm going to suggest that those decisions fall into three categories. Make decisions that are good. Can anyone give some definition of a good decision? The first point that was raised a moment ago, it would probably be a characteristic of a good decision. But anything else? What would go into making a good decision? Not a clue. Well, that's why we're here. Let me give you the kind of things that people do talk about, or the things that I already mentioned, which is representing the public, understanding and moving forward the best interests of the community, looking out for the future of the city, the good of City Hall, whatever it might be. These are all good decisions. I think the very best definition I ever heard in one of these classes came from a city council member in a city that said he saw a good decision as one that did the most good for the most people for the longest period of time. The most good for the most people for the longest period of time. That was a pretty darn good definition of what a good decision might be. And I commend it to you to think about as you do your work. But two more major characteristics of a decision, the kind of decisions that you'd want to make. The next is defensible. Defensible means simply two things, but primarily it means it's defensible in a court of law. It's carried out in accordance with the applicable laws that guide what you do. That is, there's federal law, there's state law, all kinds of those external frameworks that are created for you and for which you are held accountable. And then also there's even your own code, which is the law of the community based on the charter. There's things in the charter. The code really helps implement the charter. And that's the law. And you have a responsibility to take actions that are defensible in the context of being in accordance with all those applicable laws. The second part of defensible really is your capability to defend a decision you make that might be unpopular, to be able to understand why it was done and to justify it when you're pigeonholed a couple days later, at the grocery store, and someone says, "Why in the world did you approve that thing?" And you're able to explain why and help the person understand. They may not like it, but you've presented a defensible position on that. If at least you're going to explain it and give them some understanding of why you did what you do. But most importantly, though, in this context, we're talking about decisions that are defensible from a legal standpoint. The third arena, I believe in many ways, is the most important, and that's make decisions that are credible. I define that as a pattern of decisions that are good and defensible. And I mean a pattern, not just a one-shot thing, but where you as the council, you as the planning commission, have a long-term pattern of consistently making good and defensible decisions, and then being able to explain them to people. The credibility that comes out of, frankly, your planning process and the decisions you make might be one of the most important things that influences the relationship of City Hall with its own citizens. At the local government level, it is possibly the most controversial kind of decisions that are made, and how you as leaders in the community approach those things, both in terms of process and in terms of your decision making, builds up this degree of credibility. And of course, credibility is primarily based on trust, in that the citizens, in giving you this responsibility to make decisions grow in their trust of you and feel comfortable that you are making decisions that are in their best interest. And that builds over time. And what that means for you is it creates goodwill at City Hall. It creates those relationships where people are inclined to support what city government is doing, inclined to vote for candidates that have positive agendas instead of negative agendas, inclined, most especially, to vote for ballot titles, bond elections, those kind of things where the council comes together and says, we need to ask the voters for some money for some cause, and people tend to trust you and are prone to vote yes. That's the credibility. And a lot of it can come out of these kind of decisions that you're making around land use decisions. Any comments on that at all? Here's a little commentary. Wait a minute, aren't you the chap who refused planning permission for the St. Mary's Church expansion? Your city planners, they take a lot of crap from the public and from you sometime and stuff, but it's just a humorous look at some of the accountability possibilities in this. But any comments or feedback or experiences and these notions of doing your job? Anybody have anything to share about that? Paul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in. I like the comment that these things lead to the credible, how important that is in making decisions. That whatever we do does carry forward, and especially if we do need to go to people for money, especially for things like wastewater treatment plants that may be coming up, we have a good track record heading in.
Exactly. All right, well, let's press into the detail here. Any questions? Oh, there you go. Any questions so far? No, I think we've got. I see Matt put in the chat that I worked with the city of Damascus. Do not hold that against me. An interesting time for Clackamas County and all of Oregon, and certainly the people of Damascus. And I was deeply engaged in that whole thing all the way through. Learned a huge amount about what I call civic psychology, including what I call deviant civic psychology. And I think state government learned an awful lot too about what works and what doesn't work in the context of trying to force a local area into doing something that they don't really want to do. And I think there's been a lot of backing off as a matter of policy on ever putting something like that forward again. Someday I'll write the book. I've suggested doing a session at the league conference next year already. It's kind of a retrospective looking back at Damascus and lessons learned, because there's a lot of lessons learned there.
Hey, John, the reason why I mentioned that is not because I thought it was really relevant at all, but you had mentioned Damascus in part of your introduction and mistook us for Damascus. I know it's just because you
did I say that?
Because of all the work you've done there.
Did I say that? Oh, for Pete's sake.
So I was just trying to explain why you might have said Damascus.
There you go. Oops. Okay. Thank you for saving my bacon. I would certainly never confuse Estacada with Damascus.
I have a question.
Yes.
John, didn't you work for Lebanon? And
I did.
I've got 3 different builders that have gone down there, and they make it so easy. The whole process, it's come in, we're going to help you do whatever you're going to need to do. So if that was part of you, you did a great job from what I've heard.
It's very funny. Just today, I'm doing a big organizational audit of the planning department of Multnomah County. And we had this very conversation today about the working together to get to yes idea. And my business partner, who often teaches this class with me, ultimately became Lebanon's community development director after we had served the city for a long time as contract planners. And he very much pushed a philosophy of how do we get to yes when any applicant would come in the door. And it was a real important thing. Lebanon, now is home of Western University. which is the first new medical university on the West Coast in decades, and a huge economic boon to that community, because the development all around that university site has been very significant. The investment is in millions and millions and millions of dollars, driving a lot of local economic growth and that kind of thing. This was sponsored by Samaritan Health Systems, which is basically the health system in all of Lynn County, headquartered out of Corvallis. The first place Samaritan Health went with this idea of doing a medical university, of course, was to Corvallis, and came away quite frustrated, went to Lebanon, talked to Walt, talked to the city officials, and absolutely said, we're going to do it in Lebanon. And the reason was that in Corvallis, they got nothing but roadblocks, negativity, and huge and awful processes laid out in front of them. In Lebanon, they were offered a cup of coffee and said, sit down, let's see how we can make this work. And by golly, they did. And, Lebanon, much to Corvallis's dismay, Lebanon got the project, and it's just been a huge thing. So yeah, thanks, Gary. There's a huge lesson right there. And I know Matt's of the same frame of mind when he thinks about economic development, for sure. So, okay, good question. Thanks. Well, let's just delve a little bit into the history. And it's important to understand this history because you, as decision makers, are working within this planning system, the very values of which define exactly why you do what you do. And without understanding the values and the basic structure that those values created, it's easy for you to be making decisions in a context that really doesn't understand why you're doing what you're doing. And so let me take a little while here to just explain what was going on back in the late 60s and early 70s that led to the creation of this system. But first I want to say, I, as much as anyone in this state, believe that the system as it is way overdue for a major update. It has become extremely cumbersome, calcified, and has a lot of flaws in the system. But the fundamentals of what created it back in the late 60s and early 70s remain sound, and I think very relevant still to today. So I'm hoping that someday we will see a major reform, but I hope the parameters that started this will still be in place. Let me explain those to you. This cartoon basically represents the late 60s. Sir, the forces of sprawl, they're here already. I think it may be too late for a plan to control them. And this really was where Southern California was at that time. You all know the stories of orange groves being ripped out like crazy, ag just being destroyed, all in the Los Angeles basin, massive housing developments, strip malls, all kinds of things that were consuming all of this land, this rampant sprawl. Growing to the north, it starts growing as well up in the Bay Area. It was just a way of life for Los Angeles, very much based on the availability or the reality of an automobile culture that had a framework of freeways and streets that encouraged it. And I'm not saying that's bad, but it happened. And so sprawl was there. Now, what is sprawl? The kind of the classic definition would be very low density, low intensity development. So what we have would be fairly large lot housing, mini malls, massive parking lots, just all kinds of things that are low intensity and low density, consuming valuable farmland or forest land, things that are inherently very expensive to service, to provide urban services, to sprawl, and generally don't come away with a whole lot of sense of community. And these were all seen as evil and not desirable. And so in the late 60s, this is kind of what was happening, because those same developers were eyeing suddenly the Willamette Valley of Oregon, saying this is the next great place for us to grow. We're going to take our same California philosophies, ideas, values, and money, and we're going to start expending it and investing it in Oregon because it's ripe for the doing. And here come the bulldozers. So what happened? In the late 60s, the system emerged. It focused on the Willamette Valley, though there were reasons that there were a lot of planning kind of issues that were coming up in other parts of the state. One of the things that was very strong at the time was coastal zone management, because there was federal legislation in the late 60s that started the Federal Coastal Management Program that required a lot of protection of the very unique resources of coastal lands. And the state had a responsibility to help implement that. And that was very controversial. And, things came out of that, like the beach bill that declared, or actually was a strategy that basically declared the beaches to be a state highway, thereby protecting them in the public realm forever. Things like this. It was a time of great decisions and great movement. And that became a model that fed right into this idea of a state planning program. Tom McCall was governor at the time. He got behind the whole idea of doing a state planning program of some kind and had a couple of landmark speeches that he gave. And one of those, he talked about what he said were sagebrush subdivisions and how he hated seeing all these sagebrush subdivisions popping up, especially all over Central Oregon. And, if you drive between Sisters and Bend, you drive right through some of that area that he was talking about with those 2-acre, Sun Mountain ranchettes, which are the kind of places that were common in Arizona and the desert parts of California and in a lot of places. And he could see that kind of thing happening. Remember, he was from Prineville. So he was seeing this all in his own backyard. He didn't like it. And then he could see what was happening around the rest of the state. And there was this growing urgency that this whole sprawl thing, California style development, just didn't fit an Oregon set of values. In 1969, a bill was passed called Senate Bill 10 that basically established the framework of a state planning program, but it had no money attached to it. It was basically saying, pretty please, to the local jurisdictions to do some kind of comprehensive planning. And it proved that there needed to be more structure to this thing. So Senate Bill 100, the landmark legislation, was passed in 1973, establishing the state planning program. What is really interesting is to look at some of the history of what went on, especially in the Valley, that led to this urgency. You all know that the Willamette River runs east-west on the south side of Portland, south side of Wilsonville. And that historically in people's minds essentially was the dividing line, figuring it was going to be city to the north and country to the south. And, nothing was ever going to jump over that line. Well, all of a sudden, this place called Charbonneau, which you probably all know, jumped over the line and was developed on the south side of the Willamette River. It highly alerted a lot of people, seeing how easy it was to get that approved. And they basically had a sense this is going to be the start of that inevitable march of massive and complete sprawl and urbanization from Vancouver, Washington to Cottage Grove, Oregon, right down the I-5 Willamette Valley corridor. The other thing that happened that in many ways was more monumental was in the town of Tangent, which is just south of Albany, small, 100% ag-based community, about 500 people at the time, the center of Oregon's lawn seed industry. And a California developer bought 175 acres right at the intersection of Highway 34 and Highway 99. And, if you know the region, 34 is east-west, basically goes from Lebanon to through Corvallis and on into Walport. So it's a major east-west arterial. Highway 99 obviously is the major north-south arterial, but also I-5 was the even more major north-south arterial. So you had these three major arterials. You had three pretty good sized cities right in the vicinity of this, which is the Corvallis, Albany, and Lebanon. You had all that I-5 traffic, which brought Salem and Eugene into the realm, and you just had the perfect place to do a regional shopping center. That was the proposal, to do a regional shopping center right there in Tangent, Oregon. 5 miles from the Albany city limits, 5 miles from I-5. There was a dairy farmer in the immediate vicinity, a guy named Hector McPherson, who also happened to be the state senator from that part of Lane County, good friend of Governor McCall's. And Hector became very concerned about all of this because he could see that this would be the demise of Oregon's ag industry. It would destroy it. And being a dairy farmer, he understood the value of that industry to the state. He also understood it was a sustainable industry that could go on for millennia, while building houses is a one-shot thing. And he recognized that if there was a regional shopping center, suddenly there would be thousands of homes and mini malls and car dealerships and all kinds of stuff there. And it would really start this demise of the Willamette Valley and all it meant in terms of its character, open space, but most especially its ag industry. Got the year of Tom McCall, and other leaders on this, and they decided something needed to be done about it, which led to the Senate Bill 100. It is very interesting to note that Tom McCall was a Republican, Hector McPherson was a Republican. It was a Republican legislature. But a big part of their interest in all of this was a business interest. It was an economic development interest, focusing on the demise of the ag industry. And so while there's some sense that all of this is a big environmental thing, it fundamentally never was intended to be that. It was fundamentally intended to protect the industry and employment of the state, which reflected kind of core Republican values, of course. And that's where we are today. Let's talk about what this Senate Bill 100 did, because this really gets back to your role as city leaders and the role, frankly, of cities in this whole process and how it worked. First, a little civics lesson about how government works in Oregon. We have a system that's fairly unique in that the state legislature passes laws, but for many of those laws, they don't have any significant detail, no implementation detail in them. And the responsibility to fill in all that detail falls to boards and commissions that are appointed by the governor and ratified by the Senate. And you know these quite well. You've got the Oregon Transportation Commission, the Environmental Quality Commission, just a lot of them. And these commissions and boards have rule-making authority. So they make the rules to implement the laws the legislature has approved. They have authority to do that, and which means the legislature can only subvert that by passing some revision to the original law. So what happens in those commissions is pretty hard fast. Senate Bill 100 created the Land Conservation and Development Commission, otherwise known as LCDC. It also set in place the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD. So the way these things work is you have a commission made up of these appointed citizens, and then there's a staff that backs them up and provides staff support, just as your staff provides support to you. When the bill started, or when it went into effect, there were a number of things that happened coming right out of the gate. The bill directed this newly formed Land Conservation Development Commission to adopt statewide planning goals and guidelines, basically to establish the broad visionary framework for what the future of Oregon was going to be like. There's some parameters in Senate Bill 100 that set some direction on that, like the protection of farm and forest land, which was kind of a number one issue. And the commission spent quite a bit of time working toward that. Actually, the governor's office took the initial crack at working with people all over the state of Oregon through late 73 and all of 1974 to come up with this list of statewide planning goals and guidelines. The commission adopted them in late 1974, and then the implementation phase started right after that. But let me talk for a moment about what those goals and guidelines are and how they influence you. If you're not familiar with them, and I'd like to think that as a planning commissioner and as a city council, you are familiar with them, but you need to be, even if you're not. Staff is going to provide to you a booklet that's put out by the Department of Land Conservation and Development that's kind of a 101 about the planning goals, and I commend it to your reading. It's not terribly long, but it provides the text of the goals and a little bit of discussion of each one of them. But let me briefly tell you about them. There are 19. You are only responsible for 14 of them. I'll explain why. The first goal is really important. It's purposefully, goal 1 is citizen involvement. And it says that value, a deep and powerful value in the state of Oregon, is that citizens will be the underpinning of all of our planning work and will get to participate, influence, contribute, and must be consulted in all of the planning work that a jurisdiction undertakes. Pretty powerful. Goal 2, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but goal 2 talks about the process of planning and setting, having to have planning commissions and a number of things like that in terms of how that all works. Goals 3 and 4 are the ag goal and the timber goal, the forest lands goals. These are the goals that talk specifically about those key natural resource areas, which at the time this was adopted, those were the largest industries in the state of Oregon. Timber number 1, farm number 2. And by the way, they are still the 2 largest industries in the state of Oregon, with, of course, high tech coming in a very close number 3. But farm and forest are still the underpinnings of the economy of this state, and therefore also the character and values and nature of this state. I'm very lucky. I work with rural communities all over this state and love them dearly, and they're my passion because they reflect those kind of rural values and needs. And this is much like you. Even though you're close to the metro area, you're still an independent rural community with your own values and needs and direction. And I really admire that. Okay, so what they did is adopt these goals and guidelines. Going beyond 4, 5 up through 12 deal with specific topics. Those topics, everything from housing, transportation, parks and recreation, just a broad array of topics. And so the goals said, this is what we intend to achieve relative to this topic for the entire state of Oregon. Those were adopted, but then the next stage of this, it's important to understand, is the responsibility for implementing those goals was pushed down to the local governments, meaning the state established the fact that while the state would set the overarching broad goals, the local jurisdictions had the responsibility to adopt plans and ordinances and then to implement those plans and ordinances at the local level, with those plans and ordinances being consistent with the goals and guidelines. This created a very heady time for planning in Oregon because between 1975 and the early 80s, every jurisdiction in the state had to adopt a comprehensive plan and implementing ordinances, which are basically zoning and subdivision ordinances. Many jurisdictions had neither. I mean, a lot, especially in the more remote rural parts of the state. No such thing as a comp plan, and very little in the way of zoning, especially in places like Harney County and Grant County and such, where it's just wide open and there was no zoning about having to do with anything. State law said every jurisdiction had to come up with local plans and ordinances that had to be consistent with these statewide planning goals and guidelines. You had a lot of resistance to doing this work coming out of some quarters of the state, and then a lot of difficulty in every corner of the state at coming up with local plans and ordinances that were consistent with the statewide goals and guidelines, because sometimes those goals and guidelines were representing a broad state interest that didn't necessarily reflect the values of the local jurisdiction. So there was some conflict about a lot of things. when a jurisdiction finally came up with a comprehensive plan and a zoning ordinance and a subdivision ordinance, the next stage of the responsibility of the Land Conservation and Development Commission was to review those documents, which they did through their staff, and to acknowledge them as being in compliance with the statewide goals and guidelines. Now, notice nowhere in here did I say the state was doing zoning. The state was not doing detailed planning. It doesn't. That's the way it's set up. There's no state zoning map that anyone at the state adopts. There's no zoning code and standards that is adopted at the state level. All that responsibility goes down to the local level. These plans and ordinances were created. Notice it says the word values there at the end of it. It was still a really important piece of work to keep those local values reflected, those detailed local needs responded to in these plans and ordinances, while at the same time writing policy that was consistent with natural resource protection, open space preservation, energy guidelines, all kinds of things that were in the statewide planning goals and guidelines. Just before I go on, I told you were only responsible for 14 of these. Goal 14 is the urbanization goal that gets into everything that we will talk about in terms of urban growth management. Sets out the process for doing those things. You're responsible for that. You are not responsible for goal 15, which was the Willamette River Greenway goal. And you're not responsible for the 4 goals that are the coastal goals that only apply to coastal jurisdictions. There's only one jurisdiction in the state of Oregon that is responsible for all 19 of the planning goals and guidelines. My undying admiration for the one of you that can tell us what that one jurisdiction is. Any ideas? It's Lane County. That's the only place in the state that has both coastal, Willamette River, and then the applicability of all the 14 other goals. So you're lucky. You only have the core 14 to deal with. Notice that the title of the commission is the Land Conservation and Development Commission. People tend to think of this as very much a natural resource protection agency, an environmental protection agency. And frankly, sometimes it behaves that way and takes action that way. And I can certainly understand why people feel that. But in reality, the way it is set up, it is a Land Conservation and Development Commission. Here is why. If the goal was primarily to protect farm and forest land, and the secondary goal was to prevent sprawl, the way that that is done is by zoning farm and forest land so that it can't be divided into 2-acre ranchettes or the farms broken up to where they're not economically viable farm units, timber wantonly harvested and houses plopped in its place, that kind of thing. Those were basically said, we're not going to do anymore in Oregon. But in order to make that work, given the fact that population continues to grow, and legally we cannot stop population growth in any way, what do you do? If you want to protect that land, that means all this population, or the vast majority of it, goes into cities. But if you don't want cities to sprawl, you have to find a way to contain that. So they're just not taking off all over. And the tool that was created for doing that is a line. Any guesses of what that line is called? Paul, you've got to know. What is it? What's that line called?
I don't remember from any other presentations. I was just thinking urban growth boundaries.
And you're right.
Oh, good.
You're right. Yeah, that's the urban growth boundary. That's the primary tool in this entire system. What it does is this boundary establishes where country is country and city is city. And it's a firm line. And it says outside of this line, the primary focus is protecting farm and forest land, as well as open spaces, natural resources, and a few other things of value, but primarily viable farm and forest land. Inside the boundary, the value is having development occur. Because if we don't allow development to occur inside these urban growth boundaries, then the whole system falls out of balance and perhaps collapses. Essentially, the urban growth boundary is intended to take the market for new housing, as well as job land and all that kind of stuff, but primarily new housing, and contain it within an area where it can reasonably and economically and from a quality standpoint grow. And therefore making sure the market doesn't demand that development occur outside the urban growth boundary. It took a little more than that in terms of finding this balance, because there were a lot of property owners outside those proposed urban growth boundaries, farmers that had looked forward to dividing their land up at some point, because that was their retirement plan, perhaps, or wanting to, break it up and give it to the kids, or whatever it might be. And these are valid concerns and valid values. The legislature had to find a way to deal with that. The tool that was come up with is what's called ag tax deferral or timber tax deferral, where properties that have these tax deferrals are taxed at the lowest possible rate, therefore essentially subsidizing them, but also at the same time removing some of the speculative value that goes into owning a farm, where part of what you might be thinking is part of the value of this farm is that 10 years from now, I'm going to be able to divide it up and make several $1,000,000. And now in this new system, that doesn't exist anymore. But instead, you get really great tax benefits. And a zone was ultimately created, a draft or a modeled zone called exclusive farm use that's applied in all 36 Oregon counties, though the details are written and adopted by each county. But basically it says that if you're zoned exclusive farm use, you automatically get your ag tax deferral. And it's the same if you're zoned in a timber resource zone, you automatically get the timber tax deferral. But what does that mean inside an urban growth boundary? It means that, one, there needs to be enough land inside that urban growth boundary to allow for growth to occur. And we have a system that's been around for a couple of decades now that basically says that cities should provide a 20-year supply of buildable land inside an urban growth boundary. I'll make sure there's a 20-year supply in there, because that in theory is enough to not negatively impact the housing market or the market for that land. But it also demanded that inside those urban growth boundaries, land be developed in what's called in the statute a compact urban form, meaning no 1 acre mega mansion lots inside urban growth boundaries. It basically says that land inside the boundaries, inside cities, is going to grow at a fairly, at low density, but it's still a pretty good urban density, meaning in the case of Estacada, probably working normally somewhere between 4 and 6 dwelling units per acre, the kind of subdivisions you're used to, not subdivisions with half-acre lots or 1 acre lots, but instead 10,000 square feet, or your code actually goes down to 5,000 square foot lots. And it says also that your economic areas, commercial and industrial, are going to be developed in a fairly compact form and logical places for them instead of sprawling out all over. It also says, and this is really important, we'll talk about it more, is that the city has a responsibility for providing the core infrastructure and having systems in place to provide sewer, water, streets, storms, and parks, the core infrastructure that's really necessary to allow development to occur. It also gives, obviously, the responsibility of the city and the ability to have creative financing tools and all kinds of things available to pay for that. Bottom line is the urban growth boundary sets the line between urban and rural, country and city. And that outside the urban growth boundary, land is protected, but inside the urban growth boundary, land is to be developed. And I mean that term literally, to be developed. Land inside an urban growth boundary is predisposed to be developable legally. When we do our decision making on whether there is going to be a subdivision in a particular place and say, boy, is that a good place to have a subdivision, which in 49 other states might be the way that these things are approached, we don't do it that way. If land is in a boundary, that means that subdivision will be approved as long as the standards are met. You don't make a decision of whether a subdivision should be approved or not. You make a decision of if it's improved or when it's improved, what are those requirements that need to be placed on it to make sure it fits in. Understand that we do our planning in Oregon up front. So making those decisions about where development will occur doesn't happen application by application. And I get a sense talking to your staff somewhat that that is a point that may not be fully understood by the decision makers in the community. You don't make judgments on whether something should occur when an application is filed. You make those judgments when you actually create and adopt the plans in the first place. That's when you're not dealing with an individual property. It's when you're dealing with the broad good of the entire community. This land over here, we decide needs to be residential, this industrial, this commercial, whatever detail goes into that. And those things are set in place, implemented through zoning, administered, for instance, through subdivision code. But the decision of whether it's going to develop or not is made when the original plans are created. This means that cities have a legal responsibility to approve projects, because if cities weren't approving projects, the entire system falls apart. In order to make this system work, protect the farm and forest land, assure the creation of compact urban form, protecting sprawl, cities have a responsibility to develop and to grow. That's bottom line in the way this works. Those of you familiar with the 120-day rule, and we will talk about that in detail later, but basically it says a city must make a decision on any land use application within 120 days. And that's right through final possibility of appeals at the local level. 120 days. And the reason was the legislature was looking at that. This was probably 30 years ago and said, wow, the system isn't working because the cities are dragging their feet on making decisions. You know, we got to hold their feet to the fire and make them make decisions on these land use matters much more quickly, and therefore establish the 120-day rule. You got to do this within 120 days. That's really fast. Also, and we'll talk a lot about this, decisions are driven by criteria, not by whim or mob rule at a planning commission hearing. They're criteria that are adopted in advance, and your decisions are made in the context of those criterion. And those criterion have to be, as much as possible, clear and objective. Let me give you an example which kind of summarizes what I'm saying, and then we'll move on. Now, this doesn't have to do with residential, it has to do with industrial, but it gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Very true situation. I served as the contract city planner for many years for the city of Cascade Locks in the Gorge. Beautiful community, wonderful place. And then we're going to switch our discussion here to bottled water. So I don't care if you like bottled water or not, or the players here, let's just leave that out. That's not the point. It's just this is a good example of how this all works. The natural spring water is one of two kinds of bottled water you can get. The other is water that probably came out of a municipal tap and it's sterilized and enhanced or whatever it is, but it's still tap water. Natural spring water comes out of a natural spring, and it's certified as such, and that's more valuable in a lot of ways, at least in the marketplace. The largest selling natural spring water in the state of Oregon and the state of Washington is Arrowhead. You've all seen those bottles. They may be, you might have one in front of you right now. So Arrowhead is natural spring water. Anyone know where Arrowhead is bottled? Well, it's called Anaheim, California, which is this horrible industrial area with Disneyland plopped in the middle of it. And natural spring water, in order to be certified as such, literally the first time that water touches air is when you take the cap off the bottle, meaning that there's a well that goes into the spring and the water is drawn out of the well. It goes into some kind of piping type system and it goes to the bottling plant and it's bottled and the top is put on it and then it goes to the consumer. And that's where, that's the first time that air touches it. The Arrowhead is owned by Nestle Waters, and Nestle Waters is a, extremely big, massive conglomerate foreign company in Smart. And they, in bottling Arrowhead in Anaheim, California, said this just isn't working. It's done because our biggest market is the Pacific Northwest. We need to establish a bottling company somewhere a bottling plant somewhere in the Northwest. They had a small one in Hope, British Columbia, but nowhere near the capacity needed. So they established a number of criteria and they were going to go look for an opportunity to build a bottling plant. The criteria included they wanted to be able to obviously have to be able to source natural spring water out of a real spring. They wanted to be able to have a stainless steel pipe that would go from the spring to a bottling plant. That bottling plant had to be located in a community. There had to be a labor force there. That bottling plant also had to have rail and interstate shipping available to it. A number of things that just made sense for what they wanted to do. They took these criterion, they identified 7 cities in the Northwest that might be good sources for doing this, and they whittled it all down and came up with 2, of which one was Cascade Locks and the other was Black Diamond, Washington, which is a small town on the western slope of Mount Rainier. The front group for all of this effort went to the Black Diamond City Council meeting one night, introduced themselves and said, we're here because we want to build this industrial facility, this employer, this bottling plant. It's going to employ 55 people initially at well above average wage. And it is going to have, millions of dollars of assessed valuation, and we'll contribute, we'll support a little league team, whatever it might be. And we're ready to make this happen. And what they said is that we are willing to do whatever studies, reports, analysis you need to allow you to approve our project. The very next night they came to Cascade Locks. So I'm sitting there up at the dais with the city council, and they gave that same shtick. And at the very end, they say, we're willing to do any study, whatever you need in order to allow you to approve our application. Council looked a little confused and they turned to me and said, well, what do they need? And I said, they need a building permit. And that's what they needed. They needed a building permit. Now, what was the difference between Oregon and Washington in looking at this? And the thing is, Washington requires all of these studies, environmental analysis, traffic, all that kind of stuff. They're required of every application. So every application, they're essentially planning on whether that piece of property ought to be developed or not. In Oregon, instead, we do all of our planning up front. And we already had in place the fact that this was an industrial zone within an industrial comp plan area. It was fully zoned. It had the transportation system plan already in place that laid out where the streets needed to go, what the improvements would be necessary for the street. Same thing with water and sewer plans. All the environmental was already taken care of because all that stuff is covered in the comprehensive plan and in provisions that are in the development code. The planning's all done up front. What had to happen was just implement those plans for this particular property and this particular application by approving a building permit. And that's led to the decision to go to Cascade Locks for developing this bottling plant. Now, frankly, in the long run, the naysayers, of which there were many, so far have successfully tripped it up over a water rights issue, which has nothing to do with our state planning system. But they convinced the governor to stand in the way. And so far it's at a bit of an impasse. But from a planning perspective, this hopefully helps you understand that we do our planning up front, and then we just implement at the local level as time goes on when these applications are received. We don't judge everything. That means that what's in your development code is critically important. Not only where places are mapped, but the code provisions that go into that, the setbacks and all that kind of stuff. And then also the process. It's the process really getting to what you need to know to make your decision. But if it's all working well, it should be fairly easy to make decisions, because things coming in will tend to be already in compliance with your code. And you don't need to rejudge things or go around again on things. This applies to subdivisions. It applies to downtown development. It applies to your industrial areas. It's fundamental to the way the state works. So let's just stop right there. Does this make sense? Did you know this? Does it change your perspective? Was that helpful? What are your comments, your objections to this? Anyone have comments to share? Gee, Taylor, did you know all that?
I knew a good chunk of it, but
Okay,
you said plenty that was new to me. So
I bet that's kind of new to much of you as well.
I wrote down that piece of trivia about the only jurisdiction subject to all 19 statewide
Yeah.
planning goals. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna use that.
Yeah, you could definitely use that with the old comrades.
Uh-huh.
You betcha. So,
Hey, John,
yes.
who sets the urban growth boundary then? Is that one of the commissions?
Fabulous question, and a great question. It's the last bullet point here. It says urban versus rural. That's kind of the bottom line here. The urban growth boundary is established in cooperation between the city and the county. So usually the city will do much of the work, will propose it, but the county has to buy off on it. The urban growth boundary usually is well outside the city limits. It doesn't have to be, but it's outside the city limits. So there's this urban growth area between the city limits and the urban growth boundary. Annexation is not really a land use matter. It's basically saying, okay, this land is ready to develop and therefore we'll provide services to it, but it's got to come into the city before it can develop. It's not really a land use matter. Urban growth boundary is. The two jurisdictions work together. Obviously the state looks at these UGB amendments very thoroughly and critically. And it's a place where you have special interest groups that get very involved at looking at urban growth boundary expansions and can be very protective of that farm and forest land. None more so than the Thousand Friends of Oregon, which can become a bit of a thorn in the side of local jurisdictions sometimes. This was defined in more detail probably maybe 15 years ago, with some updates to state law about this work, in which that's where the state said that cities needed to provide a 20-year supply of buildable land inside its urban growth boundary, meaning you size the boundary based on this 20-year need. That's not a rolling one. We update it every year, but it means that methodically every 5, 6, 7 years, whatever, cities should revisit the urban growth boundary and decide whether it's adequate or not. How do you determine whether the land is adequate? This starts out with a spreadsheet exercise. It's the first part of the spreadsheet is what do we have? What's our buildable lands inventory? How much land do we have that is already designated for residential growth of, both multifamily, single family, whatever it might be. Same for commercial, same for industrial. And we say buildable lands inventory because there's a lot of lands that aren't buildable. I haven't told you this, but I did a major comp plan update for Estacada about 15 years ago. And I remember doing the buildable lands inventory. It was another planner and I in a Jeep, and man, we hit every square inch of this area, just inventorying the nature of the land. Buildable lands are those that you can just come in and pretty easily get a building permit on. What's excluded are wetlands, a lot of floodplain, steep slopes, a number of things that create constraints. So you come up with this inventory. So on a spreadsheet, you know how much land you have and by zone, and then how much of that is vacant and buildable. Second part of the exercise is looking at your needs. And every jurisdiction in the state is probably going to be doing this in earnest now that we have new population, certified new population figures from the 2020 census. So this is taking your current census numbers and projections of population and looking at your needs, especially for housing. Let me get this out of the way here for a moment.
Yeah,
Looking
and
at your
actually,
needs.
John, that's very topical because we are in the middle of housing needs analysis.
There you
right
go.
now.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
We're doing
So
that currently, yeah.
you're doing that. It's your housing needs analysis. What do we need? What do we need? By housing type, how much single family, how much multifamily, how much, by income type, whatever it might be, coming up with a statement of need. The next part of the spreadsheet exercise is to say, okay, if we need 200 new single family homes in the next 20 years, how much land will that take? Well, do a little math and assume ultimately that comes out like you have 4 dwelling units per acre. So that means you're going to need 50 more acres of land. Then you go back to your buildable lands inventory and say, well, how much vacant land do we have? And it turns out you have 35 acres of single family land that's vacant, which means you've got a net of 15 acres that you need to add to the urban growth boundary. That's a pretty simplistic way of looking at it, but that is literally the way the spreadsheet exercise works. And you look at that for each housing type. You look at that for your commercial industrial at the same time. Not necessarily at the same time, but very close. And you determine that you need X acres that might need to be added to the urban growth boundary. One responsibility is to first look and say, are there ways you can increase the density within the urban growth boundary instead of expanding the line? And so these are development code changes. One of my client cities for a long time has been Yamhill. City of Yamhill showed that they actually needed a lot more residential land, but the community said, we'd rather look at how we can increase density within the city than adding a lot of land on the outside. So we went through code revisions and lowered minimum lot sizes and brought in a pretty allowable accessory dwelling unit things and all kinds of stuff that increase the possibility of a little denser development inside. But ultimately, they're going to have to look outside. Once you know how much acres you need, then you go and say, what's the best place to put it? And you're gonna look at maybe 5, 6, 7 options, of which all of them might be options, or one of them would be the best option, whatever it is. That option primarily is determined by 2 things. One is it farm or forest land? And if it's farmland, it's the class of soils. And if they happen to be high quality farm soils, that's going to be your lowest priority for expanding the boundary. And it kind of works from there. And that's one of those things those interest groups get into, is really hammering on where these boundary expansions might happen and being pretty fierce about protecting what they think might be the highest quality farmlands. The second is infrastructure, finding those places which are the easiest to serve, where you can get sewer and water out directly. Just a quick aside, as an example, comes from Estacada, the work that I did there 15 years ago. Land on the east side of the airport is inside the urban growth boundary, and there is no practical way to get sewer or water to it because you've got an airport in the way. And so we pushed for a long time saying that probably that land ought to come out of the boundary, and instead that acreage be swapped somewhere else. And, that made sense, but it ran into a lot of backlash by a lot of people. And, I don't think that ever fully came to fruition. So, but you go through this process, you pick then the best places for the boundary expansion. The city puts it on the table, adopts it, goes to the county. The county has to concur. Obviously, throughout this process, the state through DLCD is looking at it. And ultimately, it's adopted by ordinance at both the city and the county level, subject to appeal, and many UGB expansions are appealed. Some recently have gone through in the state without appeal, which is kind of rare. Frankly, I think that's because they let the fox into the hen house and compromised an awful lot of what communities wanted just to avoid an appeal. There's one interesting case in the city of Lafayette where the Department of Land Conservation and Development came down and said, after the UGB had been adopted, the UGB expansion adopted, said, you didn't add enough because your housing needs analysis showed you needed an additional 12 acres. So they had to go back through the process and find 12 more acres to put in. I think that was kind of throwing a bone a little bit to the builders, but still that happened. That's urban growth boundaries. That's how it happened. If you look early in the history of the state, it wasn't near as sophisticated. Estacade is a great example because when the when the Estacade's comprehensive plan was adopted, the city population was about 2,500. Population projection by the year 2000, it would be a population of 10,000. And the urban growth boundary was sized adequately for 10,000, which is why if you know the maps, it's really big. It goes way outside the city limits, way up to the north and to the northeast, much more so than most communities. In reality, when the year 2000 rolled around, the population, as I recall, was something like 2,800, and it hadn't grown to 10,000. And you're not 10,000 today, and it's probably going to be a long time before you're 10,000, which means you've got a really big urban growth boundary, which in many ways is a blessing because you just don't really have to look at UGB expansions. You can accommodate for many, many years right within the boundary area that you have. What we did find way back when is a lot of land in the boundary was really miszoned, and that's a whole nother something to talk about sometime. And things needed to be moved around a lot, and there was a need for a lot more industrial ground, but the industrial ground was full of low density and medium density houses and churches. So that's why we pushed hard to do the UGB expansion of the land now that's at the northwest corner of town that's developing very rapidly with that industrial land. It was a knockdown drag out to get that land inside the urban growth boundary, but it's there and for good reason, and it's working. That's a long answer to the question.
Gary and
I'm sorry?
Paul. Oh, I see a couple of hand raises.
Yes, Paul, and then whomever else.
So if we know the size of the urban growth boundary, which we do, and you kind of touched on this, we know what's zoned what, then we know potentially how many houses we could have within that. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then if we know that, we know, potentially what kind of infrastructure we would need to have to support that. And I think that's something that is a council that we've been dealing with here, is that our growth projections had been like 4%. And over the past couple of years, it seems like we've been growing at, I believe it was 15% instead,
Right.
Putting a stress on schools, putting a stress on police and infrastructure as a whole. At what point can a planning commission or a city council legally put on the brakes of development then? Because it seems like things are in motion already, but if we're growing faster than we're prepared for, what are the options?
Well, you deny projects and the mayor goes to jail. So, it works out. Okay, here's the deal. You can't say no. You can't say no. part of the whole planning system is a requirement that you do this infrastructure planning at the same time you do your land use planning. And that infrastructure is, the plan has to size out the water pipes, the reservoirs, the distribution system, the acquisition of water, and the same thing for streets and sewer, storm drainage. It's literally sized to meet your needs over the projected growth of 20 years, just like your land use. So in theory, they come at the same time. You require developers to do an awful lot, but there's certain projects or certain types that it's just really hard to get a developer to do, like to do a reservoir. You can't take a 50 lot subdivision that doesn't in any way justify a 1 million gallon water reservoir. But that's why we have things like system development charges, where people pay into a fund to ultimately build that kind of thing. It behooves the city, obviously, to keep those plans up to date as much as possible and to aggressively work for finding the funding to implement those things, be it by making a part of development requirements or other sources that come along. Now, you raise the issue of school capacity, and I'm here to tell you that's none of your business. And I mean that. Legislature has clearly said that. And it applies not only to schools, but it applies to fire trucks and police cars and all of those other things that are essentially the infrastructure of a community. But the only thing that in considering planning applications you can take into account is literally the bottom line is, can you flush a toilet, have enough water to flush a toilet, and have a system to make sure that water's clean when it leaves town? And if you that has those are the fundamentals that are necessary for a subdivision to be there. The rest of the stuff, one, the city often doesn't have authority over it, schools in particular, and certainly fire districts and things like that. So you can't necessarily require those jurisdictions to plan and keep up. It's hard to get a developer. I mean, it doesn't make much sense to ask a developer anyway to build an elementary school that's going to sit vacant for 20 years until growth occurs around it and brings there. Essentially, what the legislature has said is that those non-pipe and asphalt facilities, the responsibility of providing them rests with the providers of those facilities, meaning school districts, fire districts, city halls having to do with police service and whatever. Those agencies are responsible for keeping up. It's not your responsibility to slow down, nor is it legal to slow down development to give an opportunity for those other agencies to catch up. Yeah, that's lobbying by the Home Builders Association more than anything else that has established that reality, but it is a bottom line reality of the legal structure of the way our planning system works. You don't carry as City Hall the water for the school district to make sure the school district's providing enough classrooms and teachers. They need to keep up.
John, are you saying then, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that we as a city should not, basically the school board fend for themselves, that we as a city planning council, they need to take care of their own. If we have a certain number, if we have the right population in our urban growth boundary, then they need to keep up with us, not us take care of them. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, and it's very succinctly put. That's exactly right. Now, for a long time, those external jurisdictions never had to do comprehensive planning at all. And that's one of the things the legislature fixed maybe 30 years ago. It requires them to do master plans independent of the city, but they have to do master plans for growth that are consistent with the city's adopted plans. And so hopefully the school district does that has those plans. In the best of all worlds, city government would have been involved in the development of those plans by members of the council sitting on the advisory committee, by strong relationships between the superintendent and the city manager, by their facility planners and your facility planners, so that it was two separate entities serving one community together very well. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen near as often as it should. Certainly you can encourage the school district to get their act together, but you can't say no to a subdivision because they show up and say, we don't have the classrooms to serve it. You would lose on appeal. That is not a legally defensible decision. Whether you like it or not, that's the way it is. It behooves you to keep the pressure on the school district to be planning and to work to implement those plans through bond elections or whatever it takes.
So
it's one of those things I said, you're not going to like what I say.
Can we go to the other side of the spectrum? Let's take a look at the city of Portland. For probably 15 or 20 years now that I've built in there, lot sizes from 75 down to 5, down to 3,
Right.
Packing people in. What is the advantage to the city to do that? I mean, is it just tax base?
No, it's really philosophical. In fact, there is a lot of work goes into that planning process in the Portland metro area. And remember, it's a whole separate country from the rest of the state in a lot of ways. So the philosophy is for a very dense urban center, urban place. By law, the city of Portland has to develop at no less than 12 dwelling units per acre. And you go to the surrounding larger cities and it's 10, and then you go to the smaller cities that are all inside the metro boundary, it can drop down to 8. But in the aggregate, they have to intend and have codes that will get to those minimum number of dwelling units per acre. A lot of surveying went into the expansion of the urban growth boundary. Certainly Portland could have, I don't mean Portland, I mean metro. In the case of Portland, Portland doesn't set the urban growth boundary. Metro, the metropolitan government, has the authority for the urban growth boundary for all 26 of the cities that fall within the Portland metropolitan urban growth boundary. So Metro sets that. And there was a very strong sentiment that was expressed in a number of recent UGB expansions that the community wanted higher density development. Now, we can look at that and say, yeah, well, that may have played really well in, the folks in urban Portland that want real urban stuff, but it didn't play so well in Tualatin and Wood Village that didn't want that kind of stuff. But not enough people to overwhelm the outcomes of those kind of surveys. So Portland takes that particular approach. I have raised many times with the Metro councilors and the Metro staff the reality that by going to that very dense urban form, they may be able to keep the urban growth boundary down and not do as much expansions, but they're pushing the market to Estacada. They're pushing the market to Malala. They're pushing the market to Scappoose, to Donald, to Dundee. And that's where you're seeing these massive 15% growth, because you present a style, a lifestyle, a quality of life, and housing prices that a significant segment of the market want. They can't get it inside the Portland metro area, and therefore you get a 15% growth rate. And that's a failing of the system, I think, and that isn't taken into account. And your 15% is much the same as those other jurisdictions. I work a lot in the Mid-Valley. It's the same thing around Salem. You go to Sublimity and you go to Monmouth and you go to Woodburn, massive growth rates, much higher than Salem's growth rate. Why? Nice neighborhoods and affordable houses and people willing to commute. And so what that creates then is that whole traffic nightmare of massive commuting populations in single family cars. And, so that's part of where the system as we have it doesn't work well. And it's part of the rethink that we ought to have in looking at that. But, those are the facts. What do you think?
We have a couple hands raised. I don't want to miss Counselor Gates, and then Matt also. Do you
Yeah.
guys still have?
Counselor.
Yeah, this is Justin. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. So I've been listening this whole time. Very, very interesting stuff, and I've been wanting to chime in, but I'm also driving and grabbing the kids from sporting events and whatnot. But I wanted to touch base with something that you said there, and I wasn't sure if you were joking or what the actual, repercussions can be. But you made a comment that said the mayor would go to jail. Like, was that a joke?
Yes.
Okay.
All
I
right.
just wanted to clarify because
Yeah,
I'm like, there's certain things that, we've done around here that's actually gotten me kind of spooked. In one thing in particular, we almost said no to somebody in their development. And, I've been told the same thing, like, hey, these are within their rights. They have this property that's in the boundaries. They meet all criteria, and we don't have a right to just tell them no if they meet all these criteria. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Okay, so if we tell them no, because I don't really have a straight answer, what happens?
Good question. No, the mayor doesn't go to jail. He's
Okay,
shamed and
good.
mercy. He's shamed and maybe loses the next election or whatever it might be. But what happens is that decision is easily appealable. It goes to the Land Use Board of Appeals, or LUBA. LUBA was created, decades ago, because it used to be all land use appeals would go into the court system, head up to district court, circuit court, then a court of appeals, thousands and thousands of dollars and huge amount of wasted time. And it was contrary to the notion that cities should be developing and should be developing quickly. So LUBA was created. It is an administrative law body. It is not a what it does is it looks at the processes that were followed, the codes that exist, and determines whether the decision that was made by the local jurisdiction was in compliance with all applicable law and criteria. It doesn't add its own judgment or change a decision or anything like that. It doesn't have any authority to do that. It just basically says, yes, you made a good defensible decision or you did not. And the unfortunate thing, we call it the $25,000 mistake, is that when a jurisdiction has a LUBA appeal, to defend that appeal the minimum cost is about $25,000 for what it costs for your staff time to prepare all the necessary materials in the record. Probably your attorney is going to be filing some kind of brief, maybe arguing it or cooperating with an applicant's attorneys that are arguing it. It can be very expensive and time consuming from a staff perspective. In order to file a LUBA appeal, it takes a $395 filing fee, which of course a group of neighbors can pass the hat and come up with $395 really quickly. It does not take an attorney to file the brief. In fact, LUBA's staff will just hand, half a dozen similar cases to someone that's interested in filing an appeal, and they can copy those. They can plagiarize those to file their own appeal. And then they do not need an attorney to participate in the process. So they can do it essentially for no cash other than the $395 filing fee. It's really easy to file a LUBA appeal. It's very expensive for a city to defend on a LUBA appeal. A LUBA appeal will do one of three things. It will either remand the decision back to the city. It will say, we find that you made some errors, so go back and fix the errors, which cities usually can do. But it's just, again, time consuming and expensive because you're putting your staff on that and all that kind of work. LUBA can affirm the decision, which is what you hope would happen. Or in the most extreme case, LUBA can reverse the decision where it finds there was some egregious error that really can't be fixed. So they can reverse the decision. They won't make their own decision, but they'll just reverse the decision and it annuls the decision that was made. These things happen all the time. And in my opinion, it's way too easy to file an appeal. But that's where it goes. No one goes to jail, but there is real cost in time and money and loss of staff resources if you have to defend against a LUBA appeal. Sean, you had a question. And then Matt, I know you did too.
I just, since we're on these things that you can and cannot do, last one to add to this is, let's say, for instance, you have a lot of development going on and your infrastructure does not meet the demand. Can you delay development during that time that you put your infrastructure back at the level it needs to be at? Can you hold back
Absolutely.
development?
Yes, you can.
And is that
There's just-
legally defensible?
Yes, as long as you do it in accordance with state law.
Good.
Wilsonville did this 20 years ago. It's probably a good example. Wilsonville just had no additional water, and yet it was one of the fastest growing cities in the state. There just literally was no water. And so they declared a moratorium, which is allowed in statute. But during the time of that moratorium, you have to do the master planning to solve the problem and get that master planning all done, including coming up with a financial plan for achieving providing that service. You have 1 year, you got another year to kind of get started on it. So in other words, you can't declare a moratorium for 10 years and just therefore you de facto stop development. But you can do it. The city of Yamhill came very close to doing it recently due to water, and they had some really large development projects out there. And in that case, rather than declaring a moratorium, the developers just stepped up to the plate and said, we'll front the cost for doing a trunk line and a reservoir. And they worked out a deal with the city for reimbursement in the future. Because had it gone to moratorium, they would have never, of course, been able to develop within the reasonable time frame of their marketing and financing needs. So it was worth it to them to avoid it. But the answer is yes. You can do that for street, sewer, water, and storm, of which primarily it's water and sewer are the ones where that happens.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Matt, you had something?
Yeah, well, Jerry, did you still have a question? I think I'm inclined to just let you go ahead and I might chime in after.
Actually, Sean asked my question, so that's why I lowered my hand, because Sean asked the same question I was gonna ask.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Sean.
You bet.
Taylor, if you can figure out how to lower my hand, go ahead and do it.
Will do.
The one thing I was just going to chime in really briefly and say, Gary asked, I thought, a really great question of, is there any advantage to density besides just tax base? I would maybe put forth the argument that density for the sake of density is not necessarily a worthwhile goal, but if you're looking at your development pattern and sprawling to the edges of your urban growth boundary, or let's not look at Oregon, let's look at some other state where they don't have a UGB, to just sprawl to the edges of or beyond the edges of development. Yes, developers may be responsible for installing the roads or installing the water or the wastewater infrastructure to get their development in place. But then once that development is online, the city now is on the hook to maintain all of that infrastructure. And so it does pay to keep your pattern of development denser so that you don't sign up for more than you want in the long term as a city. John, do you think that's fair to say?
I think that's absolutely fair to say. If you are at 6 dwelling units per acre on a given sewer line, the actual cost per unit also is less. And that accrues to helping like with lower water rates, because it's much more efficient to maintain a denser water system that's more densely used than broader. And getting into those other services, it's a lot cheaper to be able to provide EMS service in a relatively dense area compared to something that's sprawled out. It's going to cost a lot more per unit for an ambulance run. Same with police or any of those kind of services. It's just inherently economically more efficient if you have a more compact urban form. A lot of people really prefer it just simply as a lifestyle. The thing I hear that people hate density, and when you get down to it, it's because they hate what it looks like. and that notion of barracks apartments and that kind of stuff. Well, those are design standards you can work with. And for instance, when we did this work to allow denser things in Yamhill, the city didn't even have a multifamily zone, and there was a lot of opposition to that idea of barracks apartments. So we wrote the zone included as a design standard, and that every you couldn't have more than 8 units in a given building. And architecturally, it had to have offsets and jogs and porches and roofs and all kinds of stuff just to break it up. So it looked a lot more like a single family home. And people love that. And projects have been built like that, and they fit in. You can address a lot of this density stuff just by realizing what people don't like is what it's going to look like. Well, fine. You've got the authority to help mitigate stuff like that. There may be other things too, but dense doesn't mean horrible unless you allow it to be horrible. It's kind of where I come from. On the other hand, a place like Estacada, part of the characters is being lower density. So fine, you just work with that. Any other comments, questions? These are great. These are great. I'll tell you what, it's 7:45. Do you want to take a 10-minute, break real quick? Let's do that and reconvene at 7:55, and then we'll work through the rest of the stuff we have for this evening. See you in 10 minutes.
Oh, great timing. I just took a break right before you called for a break.
Perfect. If you want to accrue any questions or post anything during that time, please do so.
Sounds good. Did you say 5 or 10 minutes?
10 minutes, because if I said 5, they take 10 minutes anyway. So,
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Take a double break.
Yep. Short break. All right, let's start up and move on. Actually, we haven't gone a long ways because a lot of great discussion by you, and that's good. We'll, in the course of the next hour and our time next week, we'll get through hopefully all your questions and hopefully have some conversation to help you understand everything and do well in making good decisions, which is what this is all about. Let me jump back to slide here. I just want to talk a little bit about this planning process. You know all of this because you do it every day, like planning for dinner, or what you're gonna buy for Christmas or whatever it might be. You have information, you have context about it, analyze it and take action. And I think if it's you're planning dinner and you decide you're gonna go to a new restaurant or something, you're gonna learn whether you like that place or not, whether you're going to go back there again or order the same thing again. And this is just a constant. We do it all the time, this planning process. What we tend to leave out at City Hall is the learning component of it. So I just want to throw out the idea and make the suggestion that whenever you are dealing with a really complex issue that has been tough for you, or you've handled a controversial application, maybe you took votes amongst yourselves that were, you weren't of one mind in the decision that you made. I strongly recommend taking time at the next meeting, at the end of the agenda, hopefully where all the citizens have left or something, and you analyze that. How did we do? How was our decision-making process? How did the staff serve us? How did we serve the citizens? Were we nice people or jerks? One of the most important things of learning is remembering that nothing in the codes are locked in stone. And if you figured out that your code was not serving you well, and this gets into this whole idea of criteria, if your criteria really didn't reflect the where you think the needs and the values of the community are today compared to when the code was adopted, maybe you ought to take a look at the criteria and change them. That's not to say you can't change anything in the middle of a process. I mean, remember that an applicant is vested in the law that's in place the moment that their application is complete. You can't change the goalpost on them at all. which means you got to pay close attention to those goalposts up front and make sure they're exactly what you need and want to guide the community the way you want to go. I guess an awful lot of what I'm saying is it's worth your time and effort to be willing to take a look at your comprehensive plan and its goals and policies and the development code and its standards and say, are these things really serving us well? Learn from what happens. Tonight you're learning because kind of, I think some things sort of came to head where it was important to do that, but I'm going to suggest think about doing it on a much more regular basis. Good excuse to have a potluck dinner once a quarter or something to get together and chat about how things are going on. All right. So here's a process that probably didn't go well, but sometimes there's no explaining it. I'm sure this is out in Clackamas County somewhere where this was taken. Makes sense. Let's look at long-range planning because these are the things that we're talking about in doing this planning work that's important for you to think about doing up front. Several parts to it. One is the comprehensive plan itself, the Holy Grail. How many of you have actually read your comp plan? There you go. How many of you even know where it is? Well, that's kind of what I expected. These things are important. They actually are influential in the establishment of law. And actually, what a lot of cities have found quite recently is they can be dynamite vehicles for bringing the community together and talking about important stuff. I've seen personally 4 or 5 cities where on their own, the Planning Commission have said, we really, we read our comp plan and it's completely irrelevant because it was adopted in 1987 when the mill was still operating. Stuff like that, which, in Estacada kind of is about that case. And so the plan itself, which is a body of goals and policies and objectives, can just become irrelevant. It's not helpful in terms of guiding you where you want to go. It's worth taking a look at it once in a while. The only time it really gets hairy is if you're looking at an urban growth boundary expansion, which you really don't need to do, or you are amending policy that is pretty tight in state law, things like wetland protection and stuff like that. But if you're getting into saying, what kind of new development pattern do we want for residential? What do we want it to look like? What's our downtown? Again, you've got a strong downtown in planning process, but in other communities, what's downtown? What role does it play? That kind of thing. Those are things that you can approach yourself and work on, and it can be very useful and helpful. The comprehensive plan has a map which lays out the projected land uses 20 years from now. And I do not remember, and Taylor, maybe you can tell me, does Estacada have 2 maps, one being the zoning map and one being the comp plan map, or is it a single map system?
We technically have both, but they are the same. The difference is that the zoning map shows anything unincorporated as white.
Okay.
So
Well, of course, then that doesn't, since you don't administer that land outside, I suppose that's all right. It's good having 2 maps. When you think about it, a comprehensive plan map might say a given area is residential, but your zoning map is going to flesh that out to where you may have different types of residential in a given area, but it's all in a residential planned area. And that's a healthy way of doing it. That's good. I assume there's something built into the annexation process where automatically zones are applied to annexed land based on what the comp plan map shows.
That's
That's
right,
the norm.
unless they
Okay.
request a zone change.
Yeah, at the same time. Sure.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so you got this big comp plan. A comp plan does not have the force of law. And that ends up being really interesting in terms of a misunderstanding often about it. A comprehensive plan is nothing but a policy document. It's a legislative document. It establishes goals, policies, and objectives. It is implemented primarily through your development code, which is your zoning and subdivision ordinances. And that development code is where the rubber meets the road. It's not in the comp plan, it's in zoning. The development code has 3 parts to it. It has the zoning map, which lays out what can go where. And then it has the development regulations that says when things are developed, what they look like, meaning what are the setbacks, what are the height limits, what kind of driveway improvements, whatever it might be. All those things that define exactly how a piece of property can develop or even operate. And then the third part of the processes of changing things or considering things, but just the processes. 3 distinct parts of that code. And those are important to understand and to work with. But that is where your planning comes to rest, because that's what you develop in order to implement those comprehensive plan goals and policies. And that is what you use to evaluate applications that come in. 2 cities that I've worked with in the very recent past, the Planning Commission really wanted to update the development code because they could see it was way out of date in a lot of ways. They got into it, and in both cases, they, on their own, just came to a screeching halt because they said, we don't know what the city wants. We don't know what the citizens want in terms of housing styles or all that kind of thing. And they went back in both cases and did comprehensive plan updates in order to use that process to understand much better what the community wanted. And then they adopted goals and policies that reflected that. And then that then turned back to a review of the development code and the standards in the development code, which then now could be written in a way that rationally worked to achieve that which the community had said it wanted. Something to consider, because your basic comp plan's pretty old, and I understand your development code's pretty old, and those things are pretty important to keep up to date. I asked the question and every community can get the same answer. How many of you had a development code that was ready the first time a Dutch Bros came to town, or any kind of coffee drive-up kiosk? I've yet to find a city that actually had a development code that anticipated that kind of development, which has a lot of unique parameters to it. And I assume Estacada falls into that.
Yeah, for us, it's the Planet Cup of Joe, I think.
There you go. Exactly. Where you kind of scramble around and interpret and try to figure out how this and how that. Part of the problem is the market moves much faster than we do in keeping these things up to date. We're always playing catch up with the market. So the more you can keep your finger on the pulse of where the market is going in terms of what people want to see in terms of land uses, the better in getting your codes in ready for things like that to occur. Or to perhaps consider that maybe your codes are way too complex because they anticipate only a single style of housing development or something. And if you broadened them and made them less complex and more inclusive of a variety of ideas, it'd be easier to keep up with the market. Just various things to think about. Your zoning map, you all know what that is. To amend a zoning map requires a ordinance, and therefore that's why the council ultimately has to approve these things. The second important thing for implementing the comprehensive plan are text and map amendments, where you do take these opportunities to update the text, both of the comp plan, but more importantly, the development code, and do those updates, and also amending the maps at the same time. This is planning. This is planning. Here it says other issues, economic development, historic. This is planning. This is what Planning Commission you need to be working on, is putting your energy into making sure these things are up to date and reflecting what the community needs, because these then become the legal framework that applicants work within. And if these are not really reflecting where you are, and an applicant comes in, meets the old standards, you have to approve it. You have to approve it. There's no choice there. So keep these things up to date or working for you as best they can. This is where planning takes place. Again, just talking, we talked about this a little bit. Philosophy, 20-year supply, you do public facilities and services at the same time, meeting community needs. You still must address those goals and guidelines and be consistent with them. You don't have to quote them and adopt them. One of the things I hear is, or I hate, is when I see a city that its comprehensive plan has 14 chapters that exactly mimic the statewide planning goals. When I was doing this work in Damascus, I remember someone said that the reason that their draft plan was arranged, chapters 1 through 14, was so that it would be easy for the staff at DLCD to read it and understand what they were reading, which just, I mean, I about fell off my chair. It should be written in a way in which your citizens understand what they're reading and what it means. Heck with the staff at DLCD. This is something for you and your citizens, not for a staff that's reviewing it. Make it be right just for you. Again, here, reflect community situations and values. Question always about updates of this stuff. It used to be that jurisdictions were required by state law to update their comp plan every 6 years in order to reflect changing statutes and changing circumstances. Very few ever did it on time because it was always way too complex. It got way too complex. And it ended up being a bit of a fiasco. Also early on, the state provided a lot of grant money to do this work. And then when the economies went south at various times, that grant money went away, but the requirements still existed. So ultimately it was changed so that only jurisdictions of 10,000 and more have to do periodic review. Smaller jurisdictions such as yourself don't meet that requirement. The unfortunate part of that is that sometimes you really do want to do an update and there's very little money available to you to do that work. So you get creative in trying to figure out how that might work. But you should do it at least anytime circumstances appear to change in a community. So what's your role? Planning Commission develops the initial draft plans and implementing rules, reviews text and map amendments, makes a recommendation to council, and council reviews and adopts them. And these things are adopted by ordinance, so they go to the council, but there's some clarity in the division of responsibility. The reason planning commissions exist is because councils are very busy handling all kinds of things, from sewer rates to, library fines and budgets and all kinds of stuff. So a planning commission is established to take the load off dealing with planning work and dealing with all the day-to-day stuff, and to actually take the lead on drafting all this material and vetting this material and doing the initial hearings and getting the initial input from the public, and then recommending plan amendments and text amendments to the council, so that when the council gets them, they're pretty well baked. A lot of good work was done, and the council, because it trusts implicitly its planning commission, will accept them at face value, and often they're adopted without much difficulty. That's what you would hope for, and hopefully that's much the case. Let me talk a little bit about this legislative role, because we're going to leave for the next session next week. We're going to talk more about this quasi-judicial role, which becomes a little more controversial. The difference being legislative are where you're doing your planning, where the actions you are taking affect the entire community and not a specific piece of property. That's as opposed to the quasi-judicial role, where you are sitting as a judge adjudicating an application that an individual has made that applies only to a given property or group of properties. That's totally different. That's code administration as opposed to planning, which is this legislative role. Sometimes that could get very schizophrenic for a planning commission, because the way you approach these things is really needs to be different. The legislative role is informal. You can take in all the information you want. Broadly, there's no such thing as ex parte contact. You can have all the meetings you want as individuals, as groups, to take conversation input. In fact, you want to have big open houses on your park master plan or whatever it might be. You want to be able to talk to people in the streets so that you as decision makers can gather as much information as possible to help you make a good decision. That's legislative. That's as opposed to the quasi-judicial role, which we will deal with more next week. I've kind of hit these again, and this is going to pull us toward the end of the formal presentation tonight, but I do want to be able to answer questions and have more conversation if we're ready to do that. To implement the comprehensive plan, as I said, there's two primary things. That's the development code, zoning and subdivision in that. But there's also all these supplemental plans. A transportation system plan, which the state requires, which is basically your transportation plan, covers streets, but also covers freight delivery. If you had an airport, your airport would be, well, yeah, I mean, the airport, it's a private airport, so it's probably not so much part of it, but all of these transportation elements are part of this. There's requirements to inventory and protect historic resources, again, public facilities, specific area plans. Matt will recognize this, Arch Bridge, that's where this example came from. This actually is in West Lynn. It's a region right at the base of the Arch Bridge going to Oregon City, where a master plan for that specific area was being developed. That's what I was working on. And it's very common for cities to do plans that impact only specific and small areas, and those are supplemental. You did that with your downtown work and ultimately adopting a zone that specifically works to implement your downtown, your Main Street work. And obviously has been very successful in doing so. These plans generally are adopted as part of your comprehensive plan. They have the same force of law as the comprehensive plan, but they usually require amendments to the development code to actually have the implementable pieces to them. There also are these studies that may not be adopted in the same way, but they are needed to inform your decisions. Probably one of the most important is floodplain. You adopt by reference the FEMA floodplain maps, and you have in your code the standards required by FEMA to protect floodplain areas and to protect structures in floodplains. But you don't actually adopt the detail of those floodplain maps. Those are done by FEMA. You have the possibility, and it's always a good thing to do, is to do your own riparian and wetland work instead of relying on the work that happens at the state level. And you can adopt these inventories, like a local wetland inventory. It's not adopted as part of your code, but it's referenced in your code, and it behooves you to know that and to take advantage of that. A lot of jurisdictions have geologic hazards. You don't so much, but there are geologic hazard studies and all. You need to take those things into account in your planning decisions. Let's see. Oh, this must have been in Malala, I think. Again, someone got a little out of line at implementing the code, I think. So we're going to talk about current planning next time we get together. So let's leave it at this for my formal lecture. Sorry about lecturing tonight. But we have plenty of time for more questions and conversation if you'd like to do so. Anything having to do with urban growth management that we haven't talked about so much, or the answers haven't come forward, or anything that I can spend more time researching and coming back to you with more next week. One of the things I know that came up a lot in the questions that were submitted earlier are, what are these criteria? Where do they come from? How do they work? Who sets them and all that kind of thing. And we'll definitely deal with that next week in some detail to understand those things. Gary, you got a question?
Yeah. Tonight, the information seems to be more on the technical side. Matt and team have put together what our zoning, the 7 zones, I think it is, and kind of have laid out the map of how the city is going to be it industrial, light industrial, commercial, downtown. And I kind of thought what we would be talking about is how to move forward, since we have his base plan. How do we move forward to make a cohesive city? We've got all of our, all of our new residents are on the west side of the city. But my thought is of what we were going to be talking about is how to bring them out there into our city and make it a cohesive city. I thought it would be more of that rather than technical. So
Okay.
when will we talk about more of moving the city?
Well, technically we have 45 minutes left tonight. So, let's move into that and talk about it right now, if that's okay with everyone. Before
I
we
just
do,
wanna
any
come in
other,
and Say that the comprehensive plan map was not designed by me.
yeah,
No, but I mean,
Yeah.
wasn't you and your team kind of put that together?
Well, Gary, I think you were involved with our economic opportunities analysis in 2019, and that did an inventory and reconfigured our employment zones, and that may be what you're thinking of. So yes, I was involved with that, Taylor at the tail end, but it wasn't really my brainchild as much as it was the outcome of data analysis, like John talked about earlier in his spreadsheet exercise. We had a hired consultant that did that technical work of inventorying, of projecting needs going out into that 20-year planning horizon. And then we talked to you as part of the technical advisory committee about how we translate that data into zoning and code that accomplishes the goals of the city and its residents, like you're talking about right now. So we've done that piece for our employment zones, and then Taylor right now is leading a similar exercise that addresses housing, the residential zones.
So I think planning's main concern has been, do we have the infrastructure to support the new housing? And I think we were talking about it earlier with Sean going to jail and such. If it happened to be the same one the planning board turned down, and it got passed on to you guys on the city council. And I think the only reason it got turned down is because as a planning board, we weren't sure that our infrastructure could support another development. So I think that.
why weren't you sure of that? That's important to know. What made you think it wouldn't?
Well, I think because I think a few meetings beforehand, that was great information about the school board. We had a representative, excuse me, come out and say they were going to have to bring buildings, temporary buildings to do that. And I guess we had the assumption that we had something to do with that, their problem. But they're again, not being sure about infrastructure. I think everybody was, do we have enough water and do we have enough sewer, et cetera, and at what level of housing, because housing has been increasing exponentially here. At what point in time is it going to balance out, or are we going to be lopsided, housing versus?
Sure.
So I think in that particular one that we didn't approve, that was one of the questions. Is that correct, Tom? Do you remember that?
He seems to be nodding yes.
Okay.
Well, let me ask you a question. Wasn't information provided to you that talked about sewer and water availability on the record? That would have come from, the applicant providing something, but be even more so your own staff either confirming that, or was there not adequate guidance in your sewer and water master plans? See, my sense is no, there wasn't. You didn't feel that you were getting what you needed. Why is that?
Well, quite honestly, after your seminar that you gave, your state seminar, I realized that Taylor was giving us, if she was ready to go with approving it, then she was telling us that yes, all of our infrastructure is satisfactory to support another development. But I think at that one particular meeting, everybody was a little really not sure, because we keep hearing about the sewer treatment plant having to be moved and upgraded. And we just added, I'm not sure if we did, but a year or 2 years ago, we added another water tower. And then were we just going to add another one? So I guess there was just some apprehension of kind of, we were in limbo and we didn't have a for sure, yeah, go for it. And
I think that what I'd suggest is this gets back to that cycle, the planning process and that learning phase, that if you were uncomfortable, and obviously, you know, the planning commission said, we're going to deny because we don't have assurance that there will be adequate infrastructure. Council, for their own reason, reversed that. And it seems like maybe nobody learned anything out of that. And it might have been good to call for, as a commission, to say, we weren't getting the information we needed to feel comfortable. Staff, please put together a workshop for us, and maybe the council can be part of it, where we're just going to sit down and have a great discussion about our public facility plans and how they're being implemented, and, you know, where the pieces are. And a lot of this, I'm thinking back to Yamhill, where a huge expansion of the high school was going to take place. And it was a mess for a lot of reasons, but it kind of came out of the blue that they weren't going to be able to provide the necessary fire flow from the existing water mains and stuff. And that just created this havoc because the voters had approved this and there wasn't going to be the necessary fire flow and all of this, but it turned out a lot of it was misinformation. And we ended up getting the city engineer and getting the folks that actually had written the water master plan and getting the public works superintendent in the room and having a workshop just talking through all of that stuff. So there would be understanding and therefore confidence, one would hope, to be able to trust what the staff's saying. Or if you didn't get confidence, to be able to say, we're missing these pieces. And until you can give us this information, we're not going to be able to make findings that there are adequate sewer lines or water lines. What I'm saying is just don't allow your planning work to just stop when the meeting's over. If clearly it looks like if you could get better information or approach things in a different way, to take some time as a group to talk about those things and resolve those issues for yourself.
great idea.
You got to be able to trust Taylor. But at the same time, you've got a public works department, a city engineer, and all these other resources that can be and should be brought in. I don't know how you structure your filing fee process, and that's something Taylor and I can talk about or whatever. But you ought to be able to afford the resources you need to make decisions. Sometimes applicants will come in like doing their own traffic study. Obviously, they're going to hire a traffic engineer for a big project or whatever. They very well may do that. And you may question that traffic engineer. But frankly, your opinion doesn't hold legal weight against the professional expertise and the professional stamp of that traffic engineer. Always that's going to win if it's appealed. So having the city even retain the services of another traffic engineer to do a peer review on a controversial matter can be very helpful, just to give you the confidence you need to vote in a way that you can back up. That's a good decision. Ask for that information that you need, but be clear about it and go after it.
Yeah, so I'll just chime in to say two things. First, if I'm not mistaken, we're actually going to follow up this two-part workshop with conversations. I don't know if it'll happen all at the same meeting or how it'll get scheduled, but conversations with the city engineer, public works, and I think even though we shouldn't be approving land use based on the school district. And then second, to say that we're also working on a code amendment actually to provide through our code something that the city of Canby does, where they have an on-call traffic traffic engineer that does what you're describing, that kind of peer reviews those traffic studies to make sure that it's to what the city wants its standards to be around the traffic study scoping. And so
I know one
Right.
city that put on a retainer a wetlands and natural resources scientist, and actually provided that scientist as a default acceptable expert to applicants, and lots of environmental issues in this community. But they created a really great process to where they trusted this guy, so he would do the reports necessary on behalf of well, not on behalf of on behalf of this, in cooperation with the applicant, to put into the record, which could include a lot of recommendations, and the applicant had to accept those at face value, saying they were going to do the recommendations. There are strategies, much like what Taylor's talking about, where the city can bring some of those resources to bear and just make these processes quicker, easier, and more satisfactory in terms of getting to good decisions. The other thing that occurred to me, you talked about pulling all the pieces together, so there's more cohesiveness. I would suggest, I mean, nothing brings community together better than a great comp plan update, believe it or not. But the point is, if you're going to get in and have a conversation in the community about what kind of housing do we need and that kind of thing, it can be really valuable to help bring people together, especially if you've got a good engagement process and you're facilitating it appropriately and having these conversations. One community I can think of did a great job, the city of Monroe, down halfway between Corvallis and Eugene. And I helped them. We came up with a set of community aspirations. I think there were 10 of them. And it's where the community, and dozens of people came together basically to say, we aspire to be a community that is this in the future. And then that drove the comp plan update, and it drove the development code update, because they had something that the community had agreed on in terms of this outcome they all wanted to achieve. So they weren't arguing about the details of how big a setback should be. They instead were creatively working together to say, what do we need to do to achieve this aspiration that we share? Taylor, I'll provide a copy to you to share with the group of, it's a one pager. They pass it out, but it's amazing the guidance that provided in that community in terms of bringing the whole community together. Sometimes people can really rally around the future, and obviously planning, that's what it's all about. And helping people envision that and know that they can really influence where things are going to go can bring a community together really well. I remember way back when I was working on this comp plan update for Estacada years ago, everyone said, we want to be just like Wilsonville in terms of economic development. We got land like Wilsonville. And I had to stand up and say, folks, you live at the end of like a 25-mile long cul-de-sac. You are never going to be like Wilsonville. Wilsonville's got 2 interstate highways intersecting right in the middle of it. You are never going to be like Wilsonville. So what are you going to be like? What are the resources? What are the values? What are the unique things that you can bring to the table to really push for industrial development and employment and that kind of thing? And the community's done a great job of redefining itself, and it's not to be like Wilsonville, but it took getting away from conventional thinking and turning into much more visionary thinking about the community itself and what it can be. Let me provide this one example to Taylor. She can send it out, but I'd suggest you start thinking, are there other ways to get at this in which we can, find ways to success?
When, if I can share I'm kind of wondering what our vision is for Estacada. We have Campanella, huge, everything is to the west of the city. And where do those people go? Shopping, restaurants, whatever. They're part of Estacada. What is our vision to bring them back into Estacada rather than going to Sandy or Gresham? What can we do as a city to have all those new people in the homes be part of Estacada rather than just being west of the city.
Yeah.
I think we have to
just
build
At
a
our,
we have to build a barricade on Highway
restaurant.
224.
That's it.
Well, one of the things I thought of is, and we've talked about this for a few years, is getting another grocery store. And just getting another grocery store isn't just for better pricing, but what is keeping people from going to Sandy? Does any of us go down to Harvest Market and do our weekly shopping there? Probably not. But what can bring all those people into Estacada and keep them in a community here to go to the restaurants, to go to the Spiral Gallery? We have to come up with something to keep our town. It was just real disheartening to see Aradia close, after what they went through. But what brings people to downtown just to go to the Spiral Gallery or Mossy Rock or whatever? I would think we need something to kind of make all those people that are, all those new houses stay locally more than just going to Gresham or Sandy.
Yeah. One way to think about it is, how do we prosper as a community despite the fact there's a Fred Meyer and Sandy now?
Mhm.
Which has sucked a lot of the retail trade out of the community. Well, fine, it's not going to change, and there may not be a market for another grocery store, at least for, the way the town's growing, it'll come. But what do you do despite those things and to get there? I'm just thinking, La Center, Washington, which is, it's where the new Alani or whatever it is, casino is. Worked with them quite a few years back, and that town had just turned into another bedroom community for Vancouver and we're asking exactly the same questions. They'd lost the grocery store, and they were never going to get the grocery store back in a reasonable period of time, and so they were trying to sort out what can they do to keep people in town, and they ended up kind of coming up with this funny phrase, but it really helped change their thinking. And that is, they realized that what they needed is for a reason for families to stay in town on Saturdays. And what they were getting at had nothing to do with shopping, employment, or anything. They realized that if they could keep families in town on Saturdays, that would expand and influence the entire marketplace. And so they actually built a place for Saturday market. They encouraged the creation of, as I recall, an ice cream parlor, a few odds and ends. They really started taking advantage of their relationship with Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, which is right next door, and they always had their back turned to it instead of coming up with bird watching classes and stuff like that would keep families in the center on Saturdays. And it really helped them in rejuvenating the community, because they didn't think too big. They just thought, and they were able to find that, what I would call it, the catalyst strategy that was going to bring everything else together. You can, Estacada reeks of opportunity. You all know that. There's, all kinds of great stuff about this town. What can you concentrate that'll give you the most bang for the buck? And figuring out what that is and focusing energy and resources on that might help.
Let's start off with finding a cure for COVID, and then we'll be in good shape, because we've been down 2 years just based on lockdown and everything else. So until we can get that resolved, it's going to be a little slow, and it's going to be a little hurtful to the business community. So
it has been, and it will be. And you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
I know you know that I have thoughts on this because you and I have talked in my office before, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't just chime in briefly and say that I feel that successful communities usually have a strong sense of place and a uniqueness that differentiates them from other communities. And I I'm not saying that means we shouldn't go for another grocery store, but I don't think, I mean, I've had people emailing me before saying, Matt, you need to be contacting Costco corporate to recruit them. Because think of the jobs and think of the traffic it would generate, and it would support all the rest of our businesses. And, you know, they went on and told me how I needed to be recruiting Costco. And I guess I'll just be succinct and say, I don't think that any big box store is going to make Estacada what we all hope Estacada has the potential to be.
I would
Very
agree with
wise.
you. And I think the grocery store was just an example of, you know, what can we do to make that cohesiveness, to do what Chehalis did, something to keep people here. I just, that was just a suggestion thrown out.
Yeah, and I apologize. I didn't mean to put you in the same box as the person who told me to spend my time recruiting Costco. My answer, I guess, is what we can do to try and keep more folks local is build a rock solid sense of community and a sense of place, so that people want to come to us rather than people want to leave to go have an experience somewhere else.
So that means
Exactly.
we don't have to have a casino.
Right.
No. You know, reflecting what Matt said, I say, don't go recruit Costco, recruit customers for Costco. And you're never going to get a Costco.
No.
But you know, what the city can influence is the investment, but the most important thing you can invest in is creating customers, which is not only your residents, but places that will draw customers in on the weekend. Well, the river is number one. Access to the entire river is number two. You've got a great industrial park. You got all kinds of stuff. I mean, I've long thought there's a place for a really significant conference and convention center on the west slope of the Cascades. And I've long thought that the Estacada waterfront would be a perfect place for it. It just, go find customers. Don't go find stores, find customers and bring them in. And then reflecting the point about this, I mean, just what Matt was saying is what you really need to do also is you have to attract investment capital. I mean, cities don't build cities, private capital builds cities. So you have to create a distinction of why any investor is going to invest in Estacada instead of just going down the pike a little ways and Estacada and investing in Gresham or Malala or Woodburn or any of those places that might be somewhat in the same market area. What's the distinction? How can you create a distinction? Obviously, having one of the most attractive things I find to investors is having a city that's got its act together. And I mean, an economic development office, a planning office, a city council, a planning commission that all work well together. They know exactly what they want, where they're going. The community has some vision, has cohesiveness. It's got its act together. And that will be a massive competitive advantage for you compared to these other cities that might want those same investment dollars. Hopefully tonight starts that a little bit.
That would draw people in, but my thought is, how do we keep these people, all these people that just moved in, how do we keep them in Estacada? Not chain them up, but they came out here for a reason, a better way of life. So are all those people staying in Estacada other than just to live? They go away to work, they go away to shop, it'd be nice for us to have a downtown that has restaurants and things that would attract them on a Saturday, just like you're saying, on a Saturday night, go have dinner somewhere, go to the Spiral Gallery, go to what other things that we have to offer downtown, but something more. I guess that's just my thoughts, my dreams, is getting all those people that moved in not just an affordable home, but a place to live and raise their kids and things.
Estacada falls prey to what's, it's called the book was Bowling and Columbine, or Bowling Alone. Okay. And it's that thing that in communities like Estacada, where people leave town to work, they tend to shop where they work. And they're too tired by the time they get home to participate actively in community activities. The primary activities become Little League and church instead of City Hall. I mean, it gets harder to find volunteers to sit on the planning commission or the budget committee or whatever. So you're absolutely right. The important thing to do is find reasons that people will engage, and they've got to feel that some good's going to come from it, that they're not wasting their time.
Right. I'm sure we've all been to cities. I was in Nevada one time, and I could picture everybody after one of the Rangers football games. Where does the family go? And, all the people go to celebrate. They don't, they kind of, what's there, I don't know, that's just what I'd be looking for, is those kind of things, after the baseball games, after the soccer games, Saturdays, whatever, for people that live here, have a place to go and congregate, meet other neighbors and.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a big question, especially for a small town like Estacada, and Sean bringing up what COVID is doing as well too. Definitely impacting businesses. One thing I hear quite a bit is that COVID has accelerated some trends that are already happening, like the end of casual dining and the end of big box stores. That's a negative. From a positive standpoint, it's accelerated other things like DoorDash, ways to get food to people, delivery systems, things like that. So, really a lot of challenge for small businesses in a small town like this is how to roll with it and figure out how to get to the people, almost as much as how to get people to them as well too. But I think we're doing a lot of good things in Estacada. We've got the Estacada Downtown Commission. We've got the Arts Commission. We've got a lot of good things to focus on bringing out the good in Estacada, plus working on getting access to the river as well too. We've got things in place that I think we're heading in a great direction. And if we look at the fact that we're growing by 15% per year, something positive is going on there for sure.
I would absolutely agree. But this is, and we can blame the COVID for a lot of things, but this would be the time for us to come up with things. We know COVID is going to go away at a point in time. This is the time to brainstorm and try and get out in front of this. And then when this COVID is done, implement some of the ideas all of you and may have to make us a cohesive town. I love downtown. I think what the city's doing for downtown, improving the murals, the painting, everything that's happening downtown is really, exemplifying what it can be. And now I think is the time that we come up with maybe some ideas to get that to just continue to roll.
So a couple of things that I've thought of, in the past that I haven't brought to Matt's attention yet because of COVID. But Estacada, back when I was a kid, Eagle Creek was a destination center on the weekends. There was that softball facility there at the Foundry. There were, I think, 5 or 6 softball fields. There were tournaments held there pretty much every weekend. And it was an a destination place during the summertime, spring and summer, we don't have that. We don't have that event center destination place anymore. So a couple of things that would be, at least before COVID, were really picking up steam were like the Spartan race, where the only place locally or the only place close that they hold the Spartan race is in Washougal. And it's a big event. It's a big event where they draw in 1,000 competitors to that thing, and that would be something cool. That would be something locals could go watch. That would be something that would draw people in from outside. And the other thing that I was thinking about is a retreat destination for corporate retreats. Corporate retreats, stuff like that. Estacada would be a great place for something like that. Just trying to make it a destination center, someplace that, that's inviting for people to come to. But like I said, the thing that I remember as a kid is, going to, even as a young adult, playing in those softball games, but going to the Foundry and, spending pretty much a whole weekend there playing softball or watching softball, but we really don't have that out here right now. And it's something that I'd really like to see moving forward.
It's a great idea.
Mhm.
Scappoose does that. I remember when my kids were playing baseball in Scappoose, and there a lot of small towns have tournaments, because you have road, kids, young kids. I think mine were like in the 5th or 6th grade, taking them out to Scappoose to play baseball all day because there's a group of regional kids. But those two ideas are great. And that's kind of what I was kind of getting to, not just a grocery store, but ideas coming up that maybe end up after all this with 5 or whatever ideas that we could kind of push forward to do just that. I mean, those are great ideas.
I'm going to send to Taylor another document besides Monroe. This is the city of Banks, which is out west of Hillsborough. It's outside the metro urban growth boundary, but it's only 8 miles from Hillsborough. Town of about 1,800, languished for years and years and years, farm community, and a downtown that, pretty bad. What we worked with them is, it's what we ended up calling an economic roadmap. And it was intended to help the city solidify around a realistic, I mean realistic set of economic goals and ideas, and then a roadmap for achieving those things. They have followed that, they've modified it, they've used it, they've been very successful with it. And so I want to share that with you, because I just want to give you some idea for your thinking about how to approach something like this. One of the things that Banks realized, and this was all way before COVID, I mean, this is like 5 or 6 years ago, was telecommuting and the increasing development of telecommuting as being a very important part of the economy. And they recognized that, like places like Intel, a tremendous amount of the employees are contract employees that are working out of their home office. And they're saying, why don't we become just where everyone wants to live that's going to telecommute, for Intel? And, once in a while, they got to run in for a meeting or something that's only 10 miles away. And they focused on that as an economic opportunity, which is reflected in this roadmap. And they've done a lot of things toward that, which included, what are the kind of things that we need to encourage in the downtown area that would support people who are telecommuting, working from home, coffee shops, whatever it might be. And just thinking that aligned around not just a whole bunch of great fancy ideas, but instead a specific strategy to get toward an outcome everyone agreed upon. I'll offer that to you just as an idea of a way to think about approaching what you're talking about. I would think Estacada would be a cool place, for a bunch of folks that are working out of home offices, home entrepreneurs, not even offices, but small craftspeople and things like that, because you got a quality of life that's pretty unsurpassed. Wow.
I don't mean to say that the work is done, but I'll just chime in and say one of the outcomes of our EOA and the reconfiguring of the zoning map was the riverfront commercial area, Gary, you may remember, and the mill site, which was formerly zoned for heavy industry. Both of those areas have been zoned to allow for hospitality and retreat center type development. So at least we've cleared away at least one obstacle.
Yeah. Terrific.
Well, how as a city do we formulate like Jerry's idea, putting those two things together? My thought on the end of this, that we would come up with a handful of items that we could actually work on, be it a conference center or say a handful, and then get groups together. What do we need to put this together? What do we need to, I can't remember, what was the one water one you were talking about, Jerry? What was
The Spartan race?
Spartan race, right?
Yeah, that's it's basically just like an obstacle course type thing where they get, it's a race that they run, and then at certain points there's different obstacles that they have to do. But it's hugely, at least before COVID, it was absolutely hugely popular. And again, there were hundreds, if not 1,000 people competing at just about every event. And it draws people from all across the country. But I mean, that would be a little ways out because we just don't have facility, like motels, hotels, that type of facility to do something like that. But like the corporate retreat idea, I think that would be a little bit more feasible because we're just far enough away from town to get people from town out here, and we're close enough to town to where they can just do a day trip, or if the facility was right, they could book an overnight or over the weekend thing where they get away from the hustle and bustle of town, out to a quieter community. They get out here and they do their thing at their retreat, whatever meetings or whatever they're going to do, team building exercises, whatever. And then there's the downtown. It brings them into downtown to do, eat whatever. And then they're back at the facility. But, that's something that I think would be a little more feasible in the short term. Something like the Spartan race would have to, there would have to be,
But it would have to start somewhere.
You're right.
Obviously, it doesn't have to start huge, but
Right.
that's something. And hopefully at the end of these two things, like I say again, we could have a handful of things that we could look at and we could all agree on, and kind of focus on moving forward to those things. Like you say, the Spartan race, that I'm sure some of the other commissioners have ideas of things that could happen in the city. But that was kind of my hope at the end of this.
Frankly, that's not the purpose of this, of the workshop as the staff and I have put it together. It's been more training on the planning process, urban growth management, that kind of thing. That's not to say we can't take that time to have that conversation, as long as we're still getting the rest of the curriculum in. That's appropriate. But something that definitely can come out of this is some agreement on next steps that you want to take, which could be a much more focused conversation, exactly as you're talking about, Gary. And that's when they're probably just the planning commission having that conversation isn't probably, I'm going to say, you want the broader community to be part of a lot of that too. But you can set the stage in the work we're going to do together for having those conversations. Decide what you're going to do.
Great, it's a start.
Yep, definitely a start. Good to do that. Well, our time is just about up for this evening. When do we meet again? Tuesday night, I think. And I'll be talking with staff on exactly where they want that to go. Because I think it probably wants to not deal with some of the things that's in my regular curriculum because what you want is much more this brainstorming kind of work. And so we can do that as best we can. If you have any questions that come up in the interim, ideas or whatever, please, feed those to Taylor, and we'll do everything we can to incorporate those things and make sure we get to all the questions that were raised in advance. So with that, why don't we close for the evening? Thank you again for giving your whole evening to your community. You're my heroes, and I mean that sincerely. So I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.